There is a kind of person most of us have encountered at some point, and the encounter tends to leave a specific residue. Not simply unpleasantness, not simply the ordinary friction of difficult personalities, but something more specific and more draining than that. A conversation that you leave feeling somehow smaller than when you entered it. An interaction that, regardless of how it began, ends with you feeling off balance, slightly destabilized, as though the ground beneath your sense of yourself has been quietly shifted while you are focused elsewhere. You replay it afterward, trying to identify exactly what went wrong, who said what, whether your response was appropriate, whether you should have said something different, whether you were overreacting. The loop continues longer than the original interaction warrants. And while you are running this loop, the person who triggered it has almost certainly already moved on to their next encounter. Perfectly intact. This is the signature experience of extended contact with what Carl Jung, in his clinical work, identified as a person operating primarily from an unintegrated shadow, and what more recent psychological literature describes with terms ranging from narcissistic personality structure to toxic relational patterns, the specific quality of this experience, and particularly the cognitive loop that persists long after the interaction itself has ended, is worth examining closely before we move to the theoretical framework, because it contains within it a precise description of the mechanism we are going to spend this video understanding. The loop itself is not random. It tends to circle around a specific set of questions. Was my response appropriate? Did I say the wrong thing? Was I overreacting? Should I have said something different? What did they actually mean by that? What are they saying about me to others? What happens next? Notice what these questions have in common. Every single one of them is oriented outward, toward the other person's behavior, their interpretation, their opinion, their next move. Every single one of them places you, cognitively and emotionally, in a reactive position in relation to a dynamic that you are no longer even physically part of. This is not coincidence. This is the dynamic continuing to run on the fuel of your attention, even after the physical interaction has ended. And this is precisely why the solution to it is not a better argument, a clearer explanation, or a more effective emotional expression. The solution is the withdrawal of the fuel itself. It is, in Jung's framework, a specific and predictable consequence of a particular kind of unconscious psychic dynamic, one in which a person unable to integrate their own shadow material manages that material by continuously projecting it outward, and in which the projection requires, in order to function effectively, a particular kind of response from its target. That response is your reaction. And the most powerful thing Jung ever said about this dynamic, the insight that underlies what has come to be called the gray rock method, is this: the projection cannot sustain itself without your energy feeding it. Remove your energy, withdraw your reaction, become, in the most precise and literal sense, uninteresting to the dynamic, and the dynamic loses its fuel source. You do not have to defeat it. You do not have to expose it, or argue with it, or prove anything to anyone. You simply have to stop feeding it. This sounds, when stated this simply, almost too obvious to be useful. The reason it is in fact deeply useful, and the reason most people find it genuinely difficult to implement, despite understanding it intellectually, is that the same psychological mechanisms that make a person vulnerable to this kind of dynamic in the first place, the desire to be understood, the instinct towards self-defense, the trained belief that clear communication resolves conflict, the deep discomfort of being misrepresented without correcting the misrepresentation, are precisely the mechanisms that the dynamic exploits to keep generating the reaction it requires. Understanding the gray rock method at an intellectual level is easy. Implementing it against the specific pull of these deeply wired responses is an entirely different challenge, one that requires not simply a technique, but a genuine shift in the psychological understanding of what is actually happening and what your actual goal in these situations should be. This script is going to provide exactly that understanding. We will trace the gray rock method back to its actual theoretical foundation in Jung's analysis of psychic energy, projection, and the shadow. We will look at the specific physiological and neurological mechanisms by which toxic relational dynamics generate their characteristic drain on the person targeted by them, drawing on research that confirms, from an entirely different scientific direction, what Jung observed clinically decades earlier. We will examine the philosophical framework provided by the Stoic tradition, and specifically by Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, who arrived at something remarkably close to the same insight from within their own entirely different tradition. We will look at the specific mythological figures Jung identified as embodiments of this dynamic, including what he called the trickster archetype and the devouring mother, and at what mythology tells us about the oldest human wisdom regarding how to navigate these forces without being consumed by them. And we will walk through the concrete, specific, practically applicable mechanics of the gray rock method itself, not as a manipulation tactic or a form of emotional withdrawal, but as a genuine, psychologically grounded practice of psychic self-preservation that also, paradoxically, offers the best available conditions for the other person to eventually encounter their own shadow material. Honestly, there is a prior question that deserves honest examination before any technique is discussed, which is the question of what you are actually dealing with when you encounter this kind of dynamic. Jung's clinical experience led him to a conclusion that remains somewhat controversial in more optimistic therapeutic frameworks, which is that not all psychological difficulties respond to the same interventions, and specifically that a certain range of personality structures characterized by a particular relationship to the shadow, specifically an inability or unwillingness to recognize projected material as one's own, produce relational dynamics that are not amenable to ordinary communication-based resolution, and that require, in the person being affected, a fundamentally different strategic orientation than the ones most people instinctively reach for. The instinctive orientation most people bring to difficult interpersonal situations is some version of the belief that the difficulty is primarily a communication problem, that if you could just explain yourself clearly enough, or understand the other person's perspective fully enough, or find the right words at the right moment, the underlying issue could be resolved. This belief is, for the vast majority of interpersonal difficulties, entirely correct. Most conflicts between people who are both operating in reasonable psychological health are, in fact, resolvable through communication, and the tools of good faith engagement, honest expression, genuine listening, and a willingness to be changed by what you hear are genuinely effective. The difficulty arises with the specific category of relational dynamic where the other person is not, in Jung's framework, operating in reasonable psychological health, where the communication problem is not a problem of insufficient clarity or inadequate vocabulary, but a problem of fundamentally different goals. Useful clinical distinction from the object relations tradition of psychotherapy helps sharpen this picture. Object relations theorists distinguish between what they call neurotic conflicts, which are difficulties arising from the clash of two relatively intact, reality-testing selves who genuinely want resolution but have conflicting needs, and character-based difficulties, which arise when one person in an interaction has a fundamentally different relationship to reality, self, and other than the person engaging with them assumes. The communication tools that resolve neurotic conflicts assume a shared goal of mutual understanding and a shared capacity for genuinely hearing the other. In character-based difficulties, these assumptions do not hold, not because the person is evil or entirely without the capacity for genuine relationship, but because the specific psychological structure they are operating produces goals in the interaction that are genuinely different from the ones the other person assumes they share. Recognizing which category you are dealing with is not a moral judgment. It is a clinical assessment, and it is the prerequisite for choosing a response strategy that actually fits the situation. When a person is operating primarily from projected shadow material, their goal in a given interaction is not, consciously or unconsciously, the goal most people bring to conflict, which is resolution and mutual understanding. Their goal, again usually unconsciously, is the generation of a particular kind of emotional response in the other person, a response that serves the specific function of confirming, sustaining, or managing the projected material. In simpler terms, what they need from you is your reaction. And this means that bringing more clarity, more vulnerability, more earnest communication to the interaction does not move toward resolution. It provides more material, more fuel for the dynamic that is generating the problem in the first place. Jung identified this dynamic with particular precision in his clinical work with what he called participation mystique, the unconscious psychological merging between two people in which the boundary between self and other becomes sufficiently porous that material belonging to one person is experienced as belonging to the other. In the specific context of toxic relational dynamics, participation mystique describes the mechanism by which a person who cannot tolerate certain aspects of their own psyche, their own rage, their own shame, their own inadequacy, manages these intolerable feelings by projecting them outward onto another person and then treating that person as though they were the actual source of the projected content. The person on the receiving end of this projection is pulled, through the very intensity of the projection, into participation mystique with the projector, beginning to carry, emotionally and cognitively, material that does not actually belong to them. This is the specific psychological mechanism underlying the characteristic experience of extended contact with a toxic relational dynamic, the sense of being somewhat unclear about your own perspective, the difficulty distinguishing your own feelings from the feelings being attributed to you, the exhaustion that comes not simply from unpleasantness, but from carrying a continuous unconscious load of someone else's shadow material. Jung documented this mechanism with particular clarity in his clinical notes on cases involving what he called the animus-possessed woman and the anima-possessed man, patterns in which a person so thoroughly projects their own unconscious contrasexual material onto their partner that the partner begins, over time, to carry the emotional weight of both their own psychology and the projector's, producing in the targeted person exactly the combination of confusion, depletion, and loss of clear self-definition that characterizes extended participation mystique. His clinical observation was that the targeted person in these dynamics almost always, without realizing it, makes the situation worse rather than better by engaging more earnestly with the content of the projections. Because this earnest engagement, however well-intentioned, confirms the projection's premise that the targeted person is actually the source of the material being projected onto them. The more honestly you try to address what is being attributed to you, the more you confirm in the projector's unconscious logic that there is indeed something here worth addressing. The projection feeds on your engagement with it, and the gray rock method, understood properly, is the practice of withdrawing from participation mystique, of re-establishing and maintaining the clear psychological boundary between self and other that the dynamic requires you to surrender. In order to keep operating, the neurological and physiological dimensions of this experience have been documented extensively in research that came long after Jung, but that confirms his clinical observations with remarkable precision. The human nervous system is, in the most fundamental sense, a social organ, continuously monitoring the emotional and relational environment and calibrating its own regulatory state accordingly. Extended contact with unpredictable, emotionally intense. Or threatening relational patterns activates the same neurological stress response systems that respond to physical threat, producing measurable increases in cortisol and adrenaline, and over time, in chronic situations, producing the physiological signature of chronic stress, including disrupted sleep, immune suppression, and the specific cognitive effects of prolonged hypervigilance. The cognitive loop of replaying and second-guessing that characterizes the aftermath of these interactions is not a personal weakness or an overreaction. It is the nervous system's threat assessment mechanism running an extended analysis on a situation that registered as potentially dangerous and that has not yet received a clear resolution signal. This neurological picture has been developed most fully in research on what is sometimes called the hyperactivated attachment system, the specific nervous system state produced by prolonged contact with unpredictable relational partners. Attachment researchers have found that intermittent reinforcement, the pattern in which an attachment figure alternates between warmth and hostility, availability and withdrawal, affirmation and criticism in ways that are not predictable, produces a form of nervous system hypervigilance that is actually more persistent and more difficult to regulate than the hypervigilance produced by consistent threat. The intermittent quality of the reinforcement keeps the nervous system's threat assessment mechanism running at an elevated level continuously, because it has learned that the environment can shift from safe to threatening at any moment and without reliable warning. This is precisely the pattern that characterizes most of the relational dynamics the Gray Rock method is designed to address, and it explains why even brief exposures to these dynamics can produce disproportionately large and prolonged stress responses. The nervous system is not overreacting to the isolated incident. It is responding appropriately to the pattern that the isolated incident represents. The Gray Rock method works at a neurological level, partly by interrupting this cycle before it fully engages. When you remove your emotional reaction from the interaction, you remove the interpersonal unpredictability that the other person's behavior was generating in your nervous system, because the most activating feature of these interactions is not the content of what is said, but the uncertainty generated by the other person's emotional volatility and the pressure to produce an adequate response. By becoming predictably, consistently unreactive, you remove the uncertainty from your own nervous system's assessment of the situation, which allows the threat response to deactivate at a speed impossible when the interaction continues to generate new unpredictable inputs. The Stoic philosophical tradition, which Jung studied and respected, arrived at a remarkably compatible insight through a completely different path. The Stoics' fundamental distinction between what is in our control and what is not, what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control, provides the philosophical foundation for exactly the psychological move the Gray Rock method requires. Epictetus observed with characteristic bluntness that the things which concern us most in our interactions with other people, how they treat us, what they think of us, whether they behave justly or unjustly toward us, are all, without exception, in the category of things that are not in our control. The only thing actually in our control is our own response, our own internal orientation, our own judgment, and our own chosen action. This does not mean passivity or indifference. Epictetus was one of the more practically engaged philosophers in the Western tradition. It means recognizing where your actual power lies and directing your energy accordingly rather than dissipating it in the attempt to control what was never controllable. Marcus Aurelius, writing his Meditations not as a philosophical treatise for others, but as a private series of reminders to himself during some of the most demanding relational and political circumstances imaginable, returns repeatedly to the same theme. When someone wrongs you, he notes, remind yourself that they are acting according to their own nature, their own understanding, their own unconscious compulsions. and that your equanimity in the face of their behavior is not a gift to them, but a preservation of your own inner freedom, which is the only thing that was ever genuinely yours to protect. Seneca. Another major Stoic voice, whose letters to Lucilius represent one of the most disdained and practically engaged explorations of inner freedom in the Western tradition, makes this point with particular sharpness in his letters on anger. He observes that the person who provokes you successfully has, in the most literal sense, taken something from you, has made a claim on your attention and your emotional energy that you did not choose to grant. The provocation succeeds, Seneca insists, not because of what the provoker has done, but because of the internal permission you give it to take effect. This is not a counsel of passivity or indifference to injustice. It is a precise identification of where your actual power lies in these situations, which is not in changing the other person's behavior, but in determining what percentage of your interior life they are allowed to occupy. The gray rock method, understood in this Stoic framework, is nothing more dramatic than the consistent, daily practice of withdrawing that permission. What you are protecting when you practice the gray rock method is not primarily your social position, your reputation, or your ability to win the argument. You are protecting your own psychic integrity, your own inner life, from the specific drain that participation, mystique with an actively projecting personality produces. The mythology Jung studied offers another set of images for understanding this dynamic that are worth examining directly. The trickster archetype, which appears across an enormous range of cultural traditions, from Loki in Norse mythology to Coyote in many Native American traditions to Hermes in the Greek, is characterized specifically by its ability to generate chaos, disruption, and confusion through the manipulation of other people's reactions. The trickster does not overpower its opponents through direct force. It manipulates them by exploiting their own expectations, their own need for things to make sense, their own emotional investment in particular outcomes. The trickster, in mythological terms, requires its victims to be reactive in order to work. And the figures who successfully navigate trickster encounters in mythology almost always do so, not by outmatching the trickster at its own game, but by becoming somehow impervious to its manipulations. By discovering a posture of non-reactivity that the trickster's strategy simply cannot find purchase on. The figure of Odysseus encountering the sirens offers a related and equally useful mythological image. The siren's song is specifically designed to exploit the listener's own desires, the wish to return home, the longing for beauty and knowledge and resolution, turning those genuine inner needs into the mechanism of destruction. Odysseus' solution, having himself tied to the mast, is exactly a gray rock solution applied to his own internal reactivity. He does not pretend the song is not beautiful. He does not deny its pull. He simply removes his own ability to act on the pull, creating a structural separation between the stimulus and the response that the stimulus was designed to produce. And through that separation, he survives what destroyed every other crew who encountered the same danger. The figure of Perseus and Medusa offers another mythological image worth examining directly. Medusa, whose direct gaze turns those who meet it to stone, can only be safely encountered through reflection, through the mirror of Perseus's polished shield. The direct encounter with the thing that petrifies you produces exactly what it promises. The indirect, mediated encounter, one step removed from direct engagement, allows both the encounter and the survival of it. Jung read these mythological structures as maps of the psyche's own navigation of its most dangerous contents. And the image of the mirrored shield is not a bad image for what the gray rock method accomplishes relationally, allowing you to remain in the vicinity of the difficult dynamic without receiving its full, direct, reactive impact. Because you have introduced a specific structural mediation between the dynamic and your own reactive core, the devouring mother archetype, which Jung analyzed extensively in his work on the anima and the collective unconscious. offers a darker and perhaps more directly applicable mythological image for the specific experience of being in a long-term relationship, whether familial or romantic or professional, with someone operating from a deeply unintegrated shadow. A composite case drawn from Jung's clinical observations illustrates the practical dimension of this clearly. A patient came to Jung after years of escalating conflict with a family member whose behavior followed a recognizable pattern. Provocative statements delivered with apparent sincerity, followed by aggressive defensiveness when the statements were challenged, followed by a period of apparent reconciliation, during which the patient inevitably disclosed something vulnerable, followed by the use of that vulnerability as ammunition in the next round of provocation. The patient had, over years, tried every available communication approach: direct confrontation, patient explanation, emotional expression, strategic silence, written letters. Nothing produced lasting change. Jung's analysis was characteristically precise. The patient was providing, in their earnest attempts to reach the other person, exactly what the other person's unconscious dynamic required, which was an engaged, reactive, emotionally invested partner in the loop. The intervention Jung suggested was not better communication, but a fundamental change in what the patient was making available to the interaction. Not withdrawal from the relationship where practical necessity required it to continue, but withdrawal of the emotional investment, the earnestness, the genuine vulnerability, the reactive presence that the loop required to keep running. The patient's initial response to this suggestion was telling. They experienced it, before trying it, as a form of cruelty, a withholding of genuine care. They experienced it after trying it, over some weeks of practice, as the first genuine freedom they had felt in years. The devouring mother, which appears across cultures in figures ranging from Kali in Hindu mythology to Medea in the Greek, to the witch figures of countless folk traditions, represents the archetypal image of a nurturing relationship that has become consuming, that gives in order to maintain dependency, that loves in ways that ultimately diminish rather than strengthen the loved one. The hero's task in myths involving this figure is not to destroy or conquer it, but to differentiate from it, to maintain or reclaim a genuine separate identity against the pull of fusion that the dynamic creates. This differentiation, this maintenance of genuine selfhood against the merging pull of participation mystique, is in structural terms exactly what the gray rock method accomplishes at the level of ordinary human relationships. Now, let's move from theoretical and mythological foundations into the concrete mechanics of what the gray rock method actually consists of and how it is actually practiced. The name itself comes from a metaphor worth holding on to because it captures something important about the quality of presence being cultivated. A gray rock on the side of a road is not threatening, not interesting, not engaging, not rewarding to interact with in any way. It does not argue. It does not defend itself. It does not explain. It does not perform. It simply is what it is, completely without the qualities that make an interaction feel worthwhile to a person seeking a particular kind of emotional fuel. You do not hate the rock. You simply pass it, the first and most foundational element of the gray rock method is the deliberate reduction of emotional expressiveness. In the specific context of interactions with the person or dynamic, you are protecting yourself from. This does not mean becoming cold, hostile, or visibly withdrawn, all of which are emotional responses, and all of which provide the same fuel as more overtly reactive responses. It means cultivating a specific quality of genuine emotional flatness in these interactions, a calm, pleasant, entirely unengaging surface that offers nothing for the dynamic to work with. Short answers. Neutral tone. No elaboration beyond what the practical situation requires. No visible hurt when provocative things are said. No visible anger. No visible enthusiasm. genuine, pleasant, utterly unremarkable blandness. This is considerably harder to execute than it sounds, because the same social instincts and relational training that produce good relationships in healthy contexts, the instinct to be genuinely present, to be responsive, to show that you are engaged, to demonstrate that you care about the other person's experience, work directly against this kind of deliberate emotional flatness. A useful frame for building this capacity comes from performance training and from the mindfulness tradition. Both traditions distinguish between an external performance and an internal state, and both offer techniques for maintaining an external presentation that does not accurately reflect the internal state, without this being experienced as dishonest or dissociative. An actor playing a neutral character while internally registering deep emotion is not suppressing the emotion. They are channeling it in a direction that does not reach the performance surface. A meditator observing their own anger or frustration without immediately acting on it is not denying the feeling. They are inserting a deliberate space between the feeling and its expression. Both of these are analogs for the gray rock practice, which requires not the elimination of genuine feeling, but the temporary non-expression of it in a specific context, supported by its full expression in a different, more appropriate one. The second element is the reduction of personal disclosure. Gray rock interactions stay resolutely on the surface, on practical topics, on logistics, on the unavoidable shared business of whatever situational or relational context requires the interaction. They do not go into feelings, aspirations, vulnerabilities, or anything that could serve as either a target or a manipulation lever. This is not dishonesty. It is a recognition that genuine self-disclosure is appropriate within relationships characterized by genuine mutual respect and good faith, and is not appropriate in contexts where it will be used against you. The third element, and the one that most distinguishes the gray rock method, as Jung would understand it, from simple avoidance or emotional shutdown, is the internal work that must accompany the external performance of non-reactivity. The gray rock method fails, and typically fails dramatically, when it is practiced as pure surface suppression of a reaction that continues to boil internally. Suppressed reactions do not disappear. They find expression through indirect channels, body language, micro-expressions, the quality of silence, and crucially through the internal stress load of maintaining a performance that is in direct conflict with one's actual emotional state. The external gray rock needs to be supported by genuine internal work, and that internal work is precisely the Jungian shadow work we have discussed in other videos in this series. This means, in practice, bringing the emotions activated by the difficult interaction into conscious awareness in a separate, safe context, not in the interaction itself. It means using journaling, active imagination, or genuine therapeutic space to process the anger, the hurt, the frustration, the disbelief that these interactions generate, rather than either discharging them in moment at the expense of the gray rock surface or suppressing them entirely at the expense of one's own psychic health. The specific journaling practice most useful here is not simply venting, which can, if practiced in isolation, simply reinforce the cognitive loop rather than dissolving it. It is a directed inquiry, asking 3 specific questions after each difficult interaction. First, what reaction was being sought from me in that interaction, and how do I know? Second, what did I actually feel underneath whatever I showed, and where in my body did I feel it? Third, what does the specific nature of my reaction tell me about my own material that is being activated here? The third question is the Jungian one, and it is the one that does the most work over time, because it consistently points toward shadow material in the person asking it that has been rendered visible, however uncomfortably, by the dynamic they are trying to navigate. One of the most consistent patterns Jung observed in this regard was what he called the helper shadow. the specific dynamic in which a person whose conscious identity is organized around being caring, helpful, and emotionally available becomes disproportionately vulnerable to dynamics that exploit exactly these qualities. The helper's shadow contains, among other things, the suppressed awareness that genuine help sometimes requires saying no, withdrawing care, and allowing another person to encounter the natural consequences of their own behavior, rather than continuously buffering them from those consequences. A person who has never examined this shadow material tends to remain in the helper role, long past the point where the help is genuinely helping, partly because the role itself has become a component of their identity, and partly because withdrawing from the role produces guilt and discomfort that feel, from the inside, like moral failure rather than psychological health. The gray rock method for such a person is not simply a protective technique. It is a confrontation with shadow material about their own needs, their own limits, and their own right to protect their psychic life from dynamics that consume it. The fourth element is the cultivation of a clear, realistic, regularly recommitted understanding of what the goal of these interactions actually is. In a healthy relationship, the goal of an interaction is connection, understanding, resolution, shared pleasure. In a gray rock interaction, the goal is the completion of whatever practical necessity requires the interaction to occur, with your own psychic integrity intact at the end. Changing the other person is not the goal. Being understood by them is not the goal. Demonstrating your own perspective or the reasonableness of your position is not the goal. These are all laudable goals in appropriate contexts, and the temptation to pursue them in gray rock contexts is extremely strong, precisely because they feel, in the moment, like the right and fair and appropriate goals to bring to any human interaction. Resisting this temptation requires continuously recommitting to the actual goal, which is simply completion with integrity. The fifth element involves what might be called the gray rock exit strategy, the specific set of practiced phrases and maneuvers for concluding interactions before they escalate to the point where maintaining the gray rock surface becomes impossible. These include things like "I have to go," "I need to get back to this later," "Let me think about that and get back to you," and the simple cultivation of reasons to leave that are readily available. Planning exits in advance of interactions you know are likely to be difficult is not cowardice. It is realistic preparation for a context that you know from experience is likely to activate the specific instincts that the gray rock method requires you to manage. The sixth element is the protection of your genuine, relational life from the contamination of the gray rock dynamic. One of the less discussed costs of extended contact with toxic relational dynamics is the way the vigilance and flatness required in those interactions can begin to bleed into interactions with people where genuine presence and genuine reactivity are not only appropriate but necessary for the relationship to thrive. Actively, consciously maintaining the distinction between the contexts that require gray rock and the contexts that require genuine full engagement is essential for preventing the method from becoming, over time, a general relational posture rather than a targeted protective practice. The seventh, and perhaps most Jungian, element is the specific practice of examining what the difficult person in your life is reflecting about your own shadow. Jung was insistent that the people who trigger us most intensely are almost always triggering something that is genuinely present in our own psyche, even when the surface-level dynamic is entirely the other person's pathology. This does not mean that what they are doing to you is your fault, or that you have caused it, or that you are responsible for their behavior. It means that even in the most clearly one-sided dynamics, there is typically some shadow material in the targeted person that the dynamic is illuminating, whether it is an unexamined belief about one's own worth, a suppressed anger that has never been given appropriate expression, an unresolved pattern from an earlier relationship that this current one is recapitulating, or a boundary that has never been clearly established because some part of the person believed they did not have the right to maintain it. Examining this material honestly, in the safe space of private reflection or genuine therapeutic engagement, is not simply useful for the gray rock method. It is the work that ultimately transforms the dynamic from something you are merely managing into something you are actually learning from. There is a specific and important question about the ethics of the gray rock method that deserves direct address. Someone reading this description might reasonably ask whether becoming deliberately less interesting, less reactive, less genuinely present with another person is a form of manipulation, a way of weaponizing inauthenticity against someone who, however difficult, is still a human being. This is a genuine concern, and it deserves a genuine answer. The gray rock method is ethical when it is used in response to a dynamic that has already demonstrated its resistance to good faith engagement, when it represents not an opening gambit, but a response to a clear pattern of behavior that causes genuine harm to the person using it, and when it is used with the understanding that the other person's ultimate well-being, and not simply your own convenience, would also be better served by a dynamic in which your reactions are not available as fuel. A person who is continuously supplied with the reactive responses they require to sustain a projecting dynamic has no external incentive to examine the internal material that is generating the projections. Removing that supply does not help them in the short term, but in the longer term, it creates the conditions, the only conditions, under which genuine change becomes possible, because it removes the external management mechanism that has been keeping the internal work at bay. Jung spent his career insisting that the path toward genuine psychological health runs through the shadow rather than around it, and that this is as true for the person generating the projections as it is for the person receiving them. The gray rock method, practiced with this understanding, is not a permanent settlement. It is a boundary that says your shadow material is not available to be managed through me. And in that refusal, it creates the possibility, never the certainty, but always the possibility, that the other person will eventually have to encounter that material through some other means. That encounter, if it happens, is the beginning of something genuine. And your refusal to provide the substitute was, paradoxically, one of the most genuinely helpful things you could have done for both of you. It is also worth noting, clearly and without unnecessary complication, that the gray rock method is not always the complete answer, and that there are situations in which the appropriate response to a toxic dynamic is not managing it through non-reactivity, but leaving it entirely. Jung himself was not a proponent of remaining in genuinely harmful situations out of some misguided commitment to psychological work. His view was that genuine individuation required genuine safety, and that attempting to do the inner work of shadow integration while remaining in a situation of ongoing harm was like trying to heal a wound while continuously reopening it. The gray rock method is most useful in situations where exit is not immediately possible, where practical considerations require ongoing contact with a difficult person, or where the relationship itself contains genuine value that makes the work of managing the dynamic worthwhile. Where none of these conditions apply, and where the most honest assessment of the situation is that the dynamic is causing harm that is not proportionate to any benefit, the most judging response available may simply be to go. The next time you leave an interaction feeling that characteristic combination of depletion, destabilization, and the cognitive loop of replay and second guessing. Take a moment before the loop begins to run. Notice the feeling clearly. Name it, and then ask yourself the specific question this framework makes available. What was being asked of me in that interaction that I did not have to give? What reaction was being sought that would have fed something I do not want to feed? The answer to that question is the first step toward the specific. psychologically grounded, deeply practical freedom that the gray rock method offers. The freedom of a person who understands what their energy is worth and has decided, quietly and without drama, to stop spending it where it does not belong. This freedom, it should be noted, is not the freedom of someone who has given up on connection, or who has decided that genuine relationship is impossible, or who has retreated into a defensive self-sufficiency that keeps the world safely at arm's length. It is the specific, hard-won freedom of someone who has learned to distinguish between the interactions that deserve their full, genuine, vulnerable presence and the interactions that require something entirely different. A quiet, consistent, unbreachable steadiness that the dynamic cannot use and eventually cannot sustain itself against. That distinction, maintained consistently and with genuine inner work supporting the outer practice, is what Jung spent his career calling by its other name. He called it individuation, the ongoing process of becoming, through exactly this kind of encounter with what is difficult and what is dark and what is genuinely demanding, more fully and more freely yourself.